Can my child take communion? This is a good question. It's a common question. It comes up all the time. A lot of churches just say, well, it depends on the parents. If you want your kids to take communion, they can. And if you think that they're not ready, then that's up to you. But the reason it's more complicated is it's a little bit like saying, well, can my daughter get married at age 14? There's a lady in our church who was married at the age of 14. She comes from a country where if you have your parents' consent, it's legal to get married at that age. So it might not be as simple as saying, well, it depends on what the parents say, or it depends on what the country says. It depends on what the church's rules are about communion. It depends on what the parents think about communion. A bigger question about marriage is my daughter ready to be married? If my son were 14 or 15 or 16, could he get married? Does he have a job? Are these people going to be financially independent? Are they mature enough? Are they ready to bring children into the world? All these types of things. There's a lot more to it than simply what do the parents say? What does the government say? It's the same with communion. Parents might think that their kids are ready. There's usually a bias involved in that. Either parents so badly want their kids to be ready that they think that they are, or their parents are so nervous about the kids being ready that they're actually even stricter than they need to be. So let's just think about this, how communion fits in with being a believer. So you have to be a believer to take communion, to take the Lord's Supper. A believer in right standing with the church. So if you are a believer, what's the first step of becoming a believer? And that is proclaiming that publicly through baptism. So you're baptized into the universal church before a local church. You are allowed to take communion in the local church. And if you sin, and are an unrepentant sin and are functioning as an unbeliever, the church will label you an unbeliever and they will excommunicate you, meaning you can no longer take communion. So those three things go together: baptism, communion, and church discipline. So when someone says, is my child ready to be baptized? I say, are they ready for church discipline? Are they ready to make their profession of faith public in a way that they'll be held accountable by the church? So if a person says, is my child ready for communion? Well, have they been baptized? Are they ready for baptism? Would you consent to them being disciplined out of the church if they started living unrepentantly as an unbeliever? Once you have those three things going together, that helps you decide, helps the parent decide, helps the child decide, helps the church decide if this individual is ready for baptism, communion, and church discipline. Now, if a person says, well, my child wants to take communion and they are a believer and I'm convinced of them being a believer, but they haven't been baptized, that's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. Again, that's sending out the wedding invitations when you haven't yet proposed. There's an order to these things. It's not a legalistic thing. If a person is a true believer and they're in the baptism process, maybe they're attending baptism classes, they're preparing their testimony, we wouldn't prevent them from taking the Lord's table. And yet there is something that's appropriate about waiting until you have made a public profession of faith that you believe in Christ through baptism and you've been welcomed into the church, that you can now take communion in the church. So for my children, the rule in our house is that once you've been baptized, you can take communion. And you can be baptized when you are living a life that is commensurate with your profession of faith, and that we would allow you to come under church discipline if you renounced your faith in Christ or if you started living like a rank unbeliever. I'm sure that you may have opinions about that. Please share them in the comments section. We can discuss that a bit more, but hopefully those principles help you.